Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight. Hope you're all good. I'll be bringing you a fantastic guest and conversation. I'll be speaking to journalist and author Helen Joyce. Helen has just released her first book, which is titled Trans: When Ideology Meets Reality. I was fortunate enough to receive an advance copy several months ago, but it is out now on general release and I highly recommend it. It's attracting a lot of praise, thankfully, but it's also attracting the entirely predictable cries of bigotry and accusations of hatred, which, having read the book myself, I can confidently tell you that no such things can be found within its pages. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to speak to Helen is precisely because her writing comes from a humanist and compassionate yet empirical perspective. So we'll be talking about why this issue has become such an important one for many women and feminists concerned with the implications and the real-world outcomes of self-ID. Also, this pervasive strand of gender ideology that appears to be taking hold in our institutions and dialogue. And Helen's book really pulls all these issues together. So I actually tend to view these issues distinct and separate from trans rights, which I agree must be guaranteed. It's a complete non-starter to suggest otherwise. So it's probably important to be clear about what I'm not saying or what I'm categorically against. So the idea of any discrimination against trans people, either in law or society, is unacceptable to me. What I am interested in, however, is focusing on the ultra-progressive ideology surrounding gender and self-ID, because I think it's not only unreasonable and false, but also harmful. I think it's incredibly hostile towards freedom of expression and especially hostile towards biological women. And to my mind, it's mostly being propagated by non-trans people. Always seems to be non-trans activists that have the loudest voices claiming to speak on behalf of others. And as we know, many trans people don't subscribe to this way of thinking either. So it's very interesting to see where this discussion, the larger discussion that is, will take us. Eventually, there seems to be somewhat of a pushback movement now, a number of opinionated and courageous women willing to put their neck on the line, and all that invites from the depths of social media and elsewhere. A quick note on pronouns and misgendering, by the way. As a rule, I tend to adopt preferred pronouns of an individual within reason. I see it as an issue of civility and politeness more than anything. As long as I'm not being compelled to say something I don't believe, then I'm generally happy. And I've also interviewed trans people on this very show and accepted their identity and pronouns without a second thought. I've spoken at conferences with trans people, actually. I've been in the presence of Blair White, Theron Mayer, and there was simply no question in my mind regarding acceptance of their identity. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not a bouncer at the door of the gender nightclub. I don't really think biological sex is that relevant until it becomes extremely relevant. And one way this is especially relevant is in the context of competitive sports. And this isn't some hypothetical. We're already seeing biological men who identify as women competing against biological women in the women's categories. And that's about to play out on the world stage too at the Tokyo Olympics with Laurel Hubbard. This is the transgender weightlifter from New Zealand. She's in her early 40s now and transitioned from male to female in their mid-30s, which has clearly had an unfair competitive advantage. I mean, this is clear to anyone who's able to understand facts. So we'll be discussing that. But in the course of discussing Hubbard's time as a man and then rapidly switching to present tense, we may have been somewhat careless with the current pronoun rules, referring to her as a him on occasion. It's a bit of a minefield, especially when the male biology is utterly central to the issue you're trying to discuss and address. So we acknowledge this issue on the podcast as well. So what I'm saying is it wasn't born out of any sort of malice. I will refer to Laurel Hubbard as a she. It's no skin off my nose, just as long as I can still point out Laurel Hubbard's biologically male, and that brings some very difficult issues when it comes to competitive sport, mixed competitive sport. Right, glad we cleared that up. There's plenty more good stuff covered in this conversation, from the new phenomenon of people claiming to be transracial, which is a hoot. We talk about how Helen's book may have been instrumental in Richard Dawkins' downfall. It was basically the end of him when the American humanist, rescinded his Humanist of the Year award in 1996. Don't think he's ever been the same since. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe and all that stuff. Leave a comment. If you're listening to this elsewhere, share it about if you can. Leave a review, leave a rating. All these things do genuinely help out. You can find Helen on Twitter at HJoyceGender. I'll put a link to her Twitter handle in the show notes. Please send her some kind words and encouragement if you've enjoyed her book, if you've enjoyed what she does, if you enjoy her tweets. Can't stress enough just how hostile and abusive social media has become for women who push back in this area. So I'm sure she'll appreciate it. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy. Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to be joined by author Helen Joyce. Helen, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. We're going to be discussing your excellent new book, Trans: When Ideology Meets Reality. I've had a copy for a little while. It's now available in all good bookshops and Amazon, so I would recommend it as well. But before we get into the details and why you've took up this particular topic, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about you. How would you describe yourself and what you do?
Well, I'm a journalist in my day job. I've been working at The Economist since 2005 in a variety of jobs. I joined as the education correspondent, and then I moved out to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, to cover mostly Brazil, but other bits of Latin America. And then since 2014, I've been editing sections of the paper, first the international section, then the finance section, and now the Britain section. So I'm commissioning copy, editing copy, sometimes writing, but mostly commissioning other people. That's what I spend the days doing. And then a couple of years ago, I stumbled on this topic by sheer chance. And last year, I took a bit of unpaid leave, I think a total of about 5 months. And in that time and around the day job, I wrote this book. So
great. So the optics on this topic, especially people who are critical of the new sort of self-ID gender ideology, there's this sort of perceived notion that it's coming from a sort of right-wing, religiously conservative slant, which to me wouldn't automatically mean that individual's wrong. But I mean, how would you describe your political leanings? I mean, it's getting harder and harder to know nowadays, but if you could sum them up, how would you do that?
I think I'm about where The Economist is, and we call ourselves radical centrists.
Right.
So I'm not politically aligned. I've never been a member of a political party. I am very critical of a lot of things that happen on every side in both American and British politics. I thought Trump was a dangerous president, but I can see why a lot of people voted for him. I hated Brexit, but couldn't stand Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, these days my politics is mostly defined by thinking very poorly of what's on offer. You know, I'm a none of the above sort of person. I'm certainly not a right-wing person, but I've never been particularly left-wing, not even as a student. I'd say I'm like one of the dying breed of 19th century liberals, really.
Right.
You know, I care about free speech. I care about freedom of belief. I care about open debate. I care about honesty, science, rationality, coexistence in multicultural societies, and how we do those things, how we can make knowledge. But I'm also somebody who feels very strongly that it's important to remember that we are animals, that we are evolved creatures that have kinship to, particularly the great apes, but all animals, and that therefore we have all sorts of biases and leanings and innate tendencies. that a rational creature that has this rationality put on top of that animality should always be mindful of. So this plays into tribalism, and it plays into all sorts of things that I think we haven't really got a grip on online in particular. So I don't know that there's any way you could label that left-right. I'm an atheist, I should have said that. I have been for a long time. I was brought up Catholic, but I lost my faith in my teens. And I mean, I really am an atheist, not an agnostic. I mean, I think this isn't one I want to sit on the fence on. Yeah, there you go. I think that probably is about enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as far removed from the sort of right-wing reactionary Christian conservative as you could possibly get. So yeah, I'm glad we cleared that up. I mean, I started focusing on this issue because my interest primarily was religion and religious fundamentalism per se, and the way in which it transgressed not only on women's rights but sort of freedom of expression, how anti-scientific it was, and that's exactly what I saw when I sort of pivoted my attention to this discussion on self-ID, gender ideology, this sort of postmodern slant on biological sex. And that's what got me interested in it. I don't typically have any skin in the game that I'm aware of. It seems to be an issue that primarily and largely affects women. But what was it that caught your interest about it? When did you start thinking you'd like to pay attention to this issue and be more vocal about it?
Well, I was asked to commission an article on it in 2017, and I did. And the result was so strange that I was interested journalistically. So when you're a journalist, you're generally not an expert in the topic. Like, hopefully you become an expert over the years that you cover a beat. But you're not, say, you don't generally have, working scientists covering science or whatever. Like, there are some exceptions in science journalism in particular. So it's quite normal to expect, and as in Brazil, I covered absolutely everything. Like, I had to cover everything from culture to economics to politics, absolutely everything. I was the only correspondent there. You're used to the approach that you have pen, will travel, ask questions. Those questions will be stupid, but the answers will help you to ask better questions, and you zoom in on whatever it is you're meant to be writing about. And no questions are off limits, really. I mean, someone could say to you, of course, they don't want to answer, or that, politely tell you that you phrased that wrongly or something. But you can't do your job if people treat you or treat questioning itself as a bigoted thing to do or as a harmful thing to do, And that was part of it, that people seemed to think that the very act of writing about any of these issues was itself a transgression. And that alerted me to something very strange that was happening. And then the next thing was really how difficult it was to express anything that you needed to say. So as a journalist, you should be a bridge between the things that are happening, the news or whatever you're writing about, the specialist topic, and really the ordinary general reader. And your responsibility is to the reader. So if something is unclear or difficult or technical, it's your job to make it accessible to ordinary people. But the language was so contorted, and any attempt to explain the language or put things in brackets was deemed to be bigoted. So if you say trans woman, I mean, really, most people just don't know what you mean. Most ordinary people still are not in this discourse at all. They just don't know what you mean by trans woman. The number of times people have said to me, is that a man who thinks he's a woman or a woman who thinks she's a man? Like, that is literally what they say. And I have said this to people inside the discourse, and they go, oh my God, that is so transphobic. It's just a fact that is what people think. And as a journalist, I have to speak to the people who are reading me in ways that they understand. So, you write trans woman, and then in brackets, you'll put born male, or, a male person who identifies as a woman or something. And people would complain about that and say that you couldn't do that. So I think that was another thing that really alerted me to the fact that something very strange was going on here, that the language had been co-opted. And we were meant to talk in a way that was to create a new reality, and nothing was to be done to remind people of the material reality underlying it, or remind people that they used to believe this a half a second ago. And those two things, I think, were the things that journalistically, hooked me and made me think, gosh, this is very different from anything else I've covered. And, I've covered such a wide range of things. Like, I've written about, the Amazon burning, or political corruption in Brazil, or, the way prisons are run there. I've written about paedophilia.
All the good stuff.
It just loads of different things. And nobody ever before has objected to me trying politely and clearly to say what's actually happening.
Yeah. Well, you touched on something interesting there with your description of it about individuals who aren't really versed in this discussion or not invested in it. And I suppose to them, as outsiders looking in at the optics of it, they'll just see somebody who seems on the face of it to have an issue with transgender people. And how do we better have this conversation in a way that reassures reasonable people who are just concerned about bigotry that that's not what our goal is, that's not what we're engaging in, that's the last thing we actually want?
Again, it's a linguistic battle. And to step back a bit and to say what the thesis of the book is, as I say, the first sentence is, this is a book about an idea, one that seems simple but has far-reaching consequences. And that idea is that whether you're a man or a woman is not just a matter of having been conceived male or female and not dying before you grew up. It's what you feel yourself to be or say yourself to be. And I think most people get that far and they're like, oh, that's a bit odd. Like, why would anyone do that? Okay, there are a few people who do that. It must be hard for them. Let's make accommodation for them. That's what most people would have thought. And it's certainly what I thought. And I didn't have a problem with that. People have some grave difficulty that's highly unusual in the way that they feel themselves to be in the world. Of course, as a civilized society, we see what we can do to accommodate all sorts of different people and all sorts of different beliefs. But actually, this isn't an idea about a few exceptional people. It's an idea about all people. So it says that you are a man because you identify to be a man, not because you just are a man. I'm a woman because I identify to be a woman. Well, how would you identify to be a man or a woman? In what sense could you say, I, Helen Joyce, feel like a man? Well, how would I know what it feels like to be a man? From my point of view, I just am a woman. Anything I feel like is just something a woman can feel like. And if I'm just saying I feel like a man, I must be looking at men and thinking, gosh, I'm more like them, or I wish I was seen like them or something. And straight away you head into stereotypes, or you head into thinking about how somebody who's very gender non-conforming moves in the world. So that's the idea. And if you subscribe to that idea, then you insist on using man and woman in those senses. And then you insist on using male and female in those senses. And then you refuse to allow people to say trans or cis even before the man or woman, cis being the opposite of trans. So I'm a cis woman, you're a cis man. And sooner or later you get to the point that you're only allowed to say maybe that this woman has a trans history. So you get yourself to a place where the only way you can talk about a male person who identifies as a woman is just the same way that you talk about a female person who identifies as a woman. Except you might be able to say that they're trans. And now you sound like you're a bigot.
Right.
Because you want to say something like, look, I have no problem with anyone living the way they live. But I do actually have a problem using a changing room along with a male person because I'm just not very comfortable. Like, I feel embarrassed. Actually, I also feel a bit scared. But if you're not allowed to say that person is male, and you have to say that they're a woman who has a trans history, you sound like it's the fact that they're trans is your issue. Your issue isn't that they're trans, it's that they're male. So this is a very linguistic fight. One side is attempting to impose their version of reality on everybody via the language, so that they take away any way that you can say what your problem is that doesn't make you sound like a bigot. And I'm trying to hang on to the material reality underlying that new language with the words male and female, so I can explain I'm not a bigot. I'm a female person who wants some spaces for female people in which male people are not allowed to enter, and that's always been allowable. So I think the way that you can get across to ordinary people requires you to take back the language. It requires you to say, those things male and female that we all know exist, they really are real and they matter. And you have to keep saying that even when people say you're not allowed to use those words, or they try to change the definition of those words.
Yeah, it does seem like a concerted effort to police what sort of descriptions we can use and how clearly we can speak about this issue. And obviously that can't be an accident. I mean, before we touch on the issue of female safety and female spaces, I suppose one of the big sort of inflammatory areas of this debate for some reason or other is the idea of genders and how many there are. So I suppose that's a good place to really start in this, is how many genders are there, and by what criteria are we using to get to this answer?
I mean, it's one of those hopelessly conflicted words that different people are using in such different ways, and I think that hasn't helped. So some people just use gender meaning sex and they didn't want to say the word sex. Or, the sentence is ambiguous about whether you mean sexual intercourse or male or female, so you use gender instead. And then a lot of feminists have always used, for decades have used the word gender to mean the social impositions on the two sexes, the meanings layered on top of the brute reality of sex. So, women are subservient and men are dominant, that sort of thing. That's gender. And then again, gender has come to, more recently in this new movement, what I call gender identity ideology or trans ideology, gender has come to mean an inner sense of what you are. And I mean, I don't know that everybody has an inner sense of what they are. I can totally imagine that somebody might feel that they are more comfortable moving in the world as a man or a woman, not what they are, like what they would like to be. I can really get that. But they're talking about something that's very like a sexed soul, an inner real sense that's more real even than your body. But once you posit something like that, there's no reason to stop there. Like, once you've made the break with material reality and you're saying that, I might have a male gender identity, well, maybe I have other gender identities, maybe I have a non-binary gender identity, or maybe I have a gender fluid gender identity, and there's no limit then. So you either have two or you have infinitely many, frankly. And you do see these hilarious lists that kids on Tumblr produce of all these splintered, more and more specific gender identities. And, you see them and you think that has to be a wind up. This really has to be somebody just taking the piss out of this movement. But actually, no, sometimes they really aren't. So, there's no answer really. Either there's two and they line up with male and female and you mean different things by it, but yeah, there are two, or there's just infinitely many.
It's funny because with it being infinite and seemingly not anchored to anything concrete in principle, we've seen what happens when that comes into collision with a similar idea, and that's the idea of being transracial now. We've had a few high-profile instances of it, and it's had out-and-out condemnation and outrage from the same sort of people who willingly and unthinkingly accept that gender's on a spectrum and you can identify as whatever you like. And it's just funny witnessing them fail to, possess the tools necessary to argue against transracialism while at the same time upholding gender identity. Now, out of interest, how do you think that's going to, are we going to move in a direction now where we're more confident in saying you can't identify as a different race and sex literally, or are we just going to start accepting transracial people as a sort of protected class now?
I mean, I think possibly neither of those. I think we may continue to regard transracial as verboten, but transgender as very precious and special. And I think the reason, I do talk about this in the book, and I trace the two are sort of theorized in different ways in academia, but I don't think that's the reason, like the fundamental reason why these two things are treated differently. But it's still instructive to look at the way that they're both theorized. So race and transracialism and so on is, in this bundle where it's very American in the specifics, but it's a historical sort of, white people have been at the top and other people are racialized. Like, white people are seen as not having a race, like they see themselves as not having a race. And that's one of the purposes of constantly talking about white people, is to get white people to notice that they have a race. Everybody else is racialized in that system. And if you want to work towards racial justice, you as a white person must be constantly aware of the fact that you too have a race and that you are in a privileged position in this racial and racially unequal and discriminatory world. And the most important thing would be not to allow you to identify out of doing that work. So if you allow a white person to identify as anything that isn't white, that person can then opt out of accepting their place in this hierarchy, in this racist society. So that's why I think they come down very hard on any white person who pretends, inverted commas, to be something other than white. Now, you could say all the same things actually about sex, because we do live in a sexist society. It always has been a sexist world. Men have been at the top and women at the bottom. Women are oppressed in myriad ways. And yet it's theorized differently. It's theorized within queer theory, in which everything that breaks boundaries is a good thing. Transgressing is seen in itself to be good. It's seen as a way to, like, invert the hierarchy. You're playing, you're gender fucking. You're playing with the system. So a man who identifies as a woman is doing a liberatory thing within that way of thinking about the world. He's smashing the two boxes, the pink and blue boxes, and he's blurring the boundary between the two sexes. And these are seen as inherently good things to do. Now, these two ways of looking at the world are completely incompatible. They just don't mesh. And yet the same people think about race and sex or race and gender in these two different ways at the same time. And when you've managed to compartmentalize your mind like that, you don't notice. So you can write these extraordinary headlines like, Rachel Dolezal, if people remember Rachel Dolezal, she was a woman of white, she is a woman of white European heritage who identified as a black woman and, got jobs that were specific for black people. Like she worked for the NAACP in America, for example. And she became the target of global vilification when this came out. Well, there were headlines that said things like Rachel Dolezal has identified into a painful and complicated history that is not hers. She appropriated a painful and complicated history that's not hers. I just can't see how someone can write that and then not say, Caitlyn Jenner has appropriated a painful and complicated history that is not his. It's just completely parallel.
Yeah.
If you think one of these things, you should think the other, but they're compartmentalized. They're in different bits of the brain. So we have seen some cases of transracialism, and I think that these people are, in a way, they're kind of entrepreneurial, aren't they? They're taking an ideology and using it in a different place. But the mainstream of social justice, as it's conceived on American campuses and therefore, unfortunately, around the world in multinationals and in social media and so on, requires you to think of these two things very separately.
Yeah. I'm just going to jot gender fucking down as a potential band name, I think. But I've got a little theory that I think you may have got Professor Richard Dawkins in a lot of hot water over his comments on Rachel Dolezal. I think that tweet was possibly inspired by reading your book.
I know it was.
Yeah, okay, so I was correct in suspecting that it's entirely your fault, essentially.
Yeah, but he gets himself into trouble on social media. It doesn't seem to worry him too much. He did have a copy of the book before it came out, as you did, and that's how he was able to endorse it. And he tweeted a few times that weekend, like he tweeted the George Orwell quote. That's one of my two, front note quotes. And said, discuss, I think. And then he did two other ones. I forget what one of them was. And then the other one was the Rachel Dolezal, like, why can Rachel Dolezal? So I'm like, oh, you're reading the book. Oh, you're reading my book. Oh, that's where you've got to now, So
I connected the dots too. I think I saw the tweets first, then I read it in your book, and the penny dropped exactly the thought process Richard Dawkins had gone along there. But I mean, that's something worth talking about here, because he's a prominent public intellectual, somebody who's always taken somewhat quote unquote controversial opinions, because I think maybe because he's gone in hard on religion on many occasions. And what is it about this one thing, this topic in general, that has got him in so much trouble that we can't have a scientist can't have, not even make definitive claims, but ask questions about self-ID and gender without humanist organizations and atheist organizations? You'd think these organizations would be best placed to suss out tribalistic dogmas, but they seem to be enforcing it, and they've sort of taken his Humanist of the Year award away. He's been blackballed.
I loved that. It was a Humanist of the Year award from, I think, 1990 something. It was 25 years old. Yeah. And yes, I mean, the idea that, we have revoked this crappy little award from 25 years ago from a man who was a giant of modern thinking, I mean, as he, I don't know if you saw the quote he gave to some British journalist, I forget which paper it was in. He said, I hadn't remembered I had this. I went to my CV to take it out and discovered that it wasn't there.
They'll be coming for his swimming certificates next.
I know, absolutely devastating. I mean, the idea that, Richard Dawkins wasn't casting glory on them with that award rather than the other way around. Yeah. I mean, who the hell do they think they are? That was hilarious. That was just the most po-faced, up themselves load of old toss.
Yeah, I've become very disillusioned with these organisations, and these typically and historically would have been my home, my people, my tribe,
so mine
to
too.
speak. And
big time.
I'm feeling now that one of the most inconvenient things for me, really, just in terms of optics, is that I'm finding that people who are on the sort of the conservative religious slant are actually making more sense on this issue than my sort of left-wing godless liberals. And how do we... am I just thinking in terms of left-wing being good and right-wing being bad here and succumbing to tribalism myself? How do we get this conversation into more reasonable circles?
I mean, I'd push back a bit, really, in a direction that you might predict, given that I said I was never left-wing. I don't think that left-wing people are inherently better than right-wing people. I don't think that either liberal or conservative are inherently better things, although I am a liberal by nature. I think these things are possibly even character traits as much as anything else. If you look around you at the world and you think about how families work and how workplaces work and how friendships work, you can see that the liberal and the conservative principles both have very important roles to play. That you don't throw things out that are working without thinking very hard. Things that we've learned by trial and error, institutions that have lasted, there's something good about them probably because they lasted. But at the same time, it's so easy to become stultifying and to be oppressive and to expect everybody to fit into boxes that don't suit them. And, I'm very much of the side of humanity that doesn't like tradition and actively prefers not to do anything just because you're meant to do it. Like, I don't like wearing a poppy. I don't like standing for the Queen. And these aren't things I think are bad. They're just things that I instinctively just don't like doing. I bristle, I don't like titles. I don't like honors. I don't like any of those things. But who am I to say that those things don't express important values for lots of other people? Like that's what liberalism means to me, a quite radical acceptance that the world looks different to other people, and that we have to find a way for people who see the world and feel the world extremely differently to live together. And the only way we can do that is to think of pluralism and of free speech and of robust and open debate, and stop trying to stop trying to shout each other down. I guess there's nothing wrong with trying to persuade other people of stuff, but I've been, since the book came out, I've really been under fire from all sorts of directions. But the most frustrating is people who agree with me about everything, and then saying that I didn't go far enough, or I didn't use tough enough language, or I sometimes was willing to call trans women she. And, to me, that's as bad as just insisting that everybody sees a male person as a woman because the male person insists he's a woman. Like, I don't have the right to impose on other people the way they see the world. I don't even want to do that. The only way I want to change the way other people see the world is by convincing them. So I'm not a religious person at all, but I've learned over time to see what it is that religious people are getting from their religion and to respect the good that they do because they're religious. I mean, obviously there's people who do bad things because of religion, but my God, there are people who do bad things because of their atheism.
Do you think? Because of their atheism, would you say?
Oh, well, right bloody now, there's a bunch of them who are trying to tell women to shut the fuck up.
Right.
And it's part of a whole package of bloody beliefs that includes their atheism. They're the ones who are putting...
I would say, well, so maybe those beliefs are godless and not informed by any theology, but I struggle with finding a direct line of causation between atheistic identity and action. For me, I suppose atheism to me is a sort of absence of a belief rather. I don't really subscribe to any sort of atheist doctrines or dogmas, if you know.
Yeah, so there you go. You see, I agree with you completely. My atheism is the same. I don't believe any of this stuff. I want to just be able to say, of all these metaphysical beliefs and sexed souls, life after death, reincarnation, I just want to say, not for me, thanks. You do you, but not for me. However, if you look at all of these atheist and humanist organizations that have become completely captured by gender identity ideology, that clearly isn't what they mean. They mean an identity.
Yeah.
They mean they're in a club now, and that club, at some point, I think there's even as always, a very, very long Slate Star Codex blog about this, about the split in the atheism movement between the social justice atheism, which was atheism plus, like I'm atheism and like the old school people who just say, I don't subscribe to metaphysical beliefs. So, obviously atheism plus won really comprehensively in terms of the organizations and the movements and the voices. And now they're the most petty little, tin pot, arrogant thought police imaginable. I really see nobody nastier than some of the big names of modern atheist movements, absolute little tosspots.
I see a lot of it coming from across the pond for sure, and it does feel like they've sort of swapped one religion for another, and it took me a little while to work out what was going on, and I suspect a lot of the American atheist identity is very much rooted in just sticking it to the Republicans and the conservatives.
Yeah, it's very tribalist. Everyone's naturally tribalist. This is what I mean when I say that part of my belief system about the world means we must accept that we are animals, we're evolved animals. And, it's only been a few thousand years that we've done things like read and write. It's the blink of an evolutionary eye that we've understood that, A implies B is not the same as not A implies not B. Like, monkeys don't know these things and we're monkeys, So these things go out the window when atavistic instincts are aroused, when you feel your tribe under threat. And that's just true for all of us. So unfortunately, atheism was a movement that had some built-in safeguards against this sort of thing, like rationalism and skepticism are meant to be things that should set your spidey senses tingling when somebody says that somebody could feel like a woman and that makes them a woman. That should immediately have got everybody going, ooh, 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 you know, that's weird. Let me think. That sounds a bit like souls. That should have happened. Yeah, but it didn't. And it didn't happen. And why? I mean, the answer has to be something to do with tribalism, because those voices were coming from the right side and not the wrong side. So I think America, the American discourse on this and many other issues has been really painfully harmed by political polarization and the belief that everything that a Republican might do is wrong and everything that a Democrat might do is right. I mean, at this point, I'm nearly as critical of Democrats as I am of Republicans.
Yeah, I know how you feel.
I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I don't see anything wrong with, somebody who's, I really don't. I've come to really respect people like this. Somebody whose religious belief is quiet and deep, and every day they get up to do the best they can because God gave them this life, and they're trying to be the best person they can in their community and care for their family and be a stand-up person. Like, what is wrong with that? It's not how I live and it's not how I feel. But if my beliefs about the world have a problem with that person, as opposed to disagreeing with their beliefs, then there's something wrong with me, not them.
Just to swing it back to the book, and something that's a very controversial, hotly debated topic and ties into this idea of female spaces and female safety. It seems to me, and this could just be my bias or the kind of information I'm getting, but it seems to me we're getting a higher frequency of news stories where there's a violent crime or a crime of a sexual nature or an assault in a prison, and the headline is that it's a woman, female perpetrator, and it takes 2 minutes to click into the article to reveal the truth that it's actually a trans woman. And so there's a lot to talk about there in the way that the journalistic code states that we should describe these incidents and individuals. But is there reason to believe that transgender people are overrepresented in crimes of a violent nature or a sexual nature? Do we have any sort of data or empirical information we can look at to discuss this in a more sensible way?
So if you're a scientific or empirical or skeptical person, your starting point, like your Bayesian prior, should be that a male person has male pattern violence and a female person has female pattern violence. So you should expect trans women to commit crimes at around the rate of men generally, and expect trans men to commit crimes at around the rate of women generally. Now, the statistics are very poor because a lot of countries have started to do their crime reporting according to self-declared gender. But that's why we keep seeing these things. I mean, until very recently, I literally never in my whole life saw a headline that said, crazed woman with axe runs amok in supermarket, decapitates somebody or something like that. This person did not actually decapitate somebody, but they seriously injured somebody. I just knew before reading any further that this is a male person, because these are not crimes that women commit. I mean, we're not strong enough for a start. You don't live in this world as a smaller, weaker person, the much more vulnerable person, and get to the age of whatever this person was, 25, 30, 35, being the sort of person who goes and runs amok in supermarkets, chopping at people. So you don't even have to believe that men are more violent by nature or something like that. You just can't live a life that brings you to that place if you're female. It doesn't matter how you identify, you just can't. So, I mean, it looks like we're seeing lots of these, but that's because you see none of them with actual female women. So they keep standing out. Like, nobody'd report them if it wasn't a woman that they were saying. Like, nobody says, bloke went online and, tried to trap children into talking to him, but failed. Because that happens all the time, right, I'm sorry to say. And so they report it because it's a woman. Well, it's actually a man, but this person says they're a woman, and now we all have to say they're a woman, and that's how the police are recording it, and it's how the journalists are writing it. And so now it's a story. So it's the dog bites man story, you see. Got it.
Right. So because it's so rare, it becomes newsworthy. But so it's not actually rare because it's a biological man.
Yeah, it's just a man, yeah. Right. So to give you some figures on crime, I think I remember the prison statistics here from the UK. There's 88,000 people in prison in, I think, England and Wales. I think they record Scotland and Northern Ireland separately. Of those, 4,000 are women, okay? So 1 in 22. Now, we also know what the profile of the crimes are. Now, 19%, again, if I remember correctly, 19% of those men, the 84,000 men, it's violent or sexual crimes. For the women, it's 4%. So it's a far smaller percentage of a far smaller percent. Very roughly speaking, of the entire prison population, 1 in 100 of those who are in for violent crimes are women. So now we think that, probably something like 1 to 3% of people do in some sense, or would in some sense if they had found the language for it or have jumped on a bandwagon or whatever, identify as trans. So it's already really clear you've just got more male women than female women who are committing any sort of violent crime. Right. You know, because the incidence rate, the base rate for violent and sexual crime among male people is just a very large multiple of that among female people. So they're just going to outnumber us, actually, in terms of violent crime. And even inside that, it's worse than that. Because if you look at the sexual crimes, that the women who are imprisoned for sexual crimes, they're usually non-contact. So, I mean, they can still be very serious crimes, but generally speaking, what they are is helping to make child porn, or assisting, lining up a victim for a rape or something like that. Those people are not physically themselves a risk to the people around them. They have done something terrible with someone else, usually a man. Whereas the men usually have just raped somebody or hit somebody or taken a knife to somebody, So, if you're actually talking about the sort of person who runs amok with an axe, it's vanishingly tiny, the number of those people who are women. If you think about the famous female criminals that horrendous people like Rose West, the reason Rose West's name is because there's just almost nobody else you've ever heard of who was like her.
And these crimes, without any sort of qualifier, am I right in thinking they are just being logged in the statistics as female crimes?
Depends which police force and depends which country. In this country, some police forces have been registering crimes since the 2000s, I think 2007, 2008, according to the stated identity of the perpetrator. Extraordinary thing happened. So the day before you and I are talking, there was a very interesting piece in the Daily Mail that Julie Bindel had written. You may remember that quite recently there was a judicial review taken by a female prisoner who was in for drug crimes of some sort. There was a trans woman in the same jail, and this trans woman sexually assaulted her. So she took a judicial review against the Ministry of Justice and the prison service, saying that they had not sufficiently considered the safety, dignity, privacy, etc. of women prisoners in their decision to allow male prisoners who have legally transitioned to be women. Like this prisoner had a gender recognition certificate, so legally this person was a woman. It's just a man with a penis and the lot. She said that they didn't have to do that. The Equality Act doesn't require them to do that. The Equality Act specifically gives the government and service providers and so on an out. They don't have to treat trans women who have gender recognition certificates as women if that's going to be harmful for women in general. So they could have not put that prisoner in there, but they decided to. And she went and she said that they hadn't given sufficient weight to the needs and feelings and so on of the female prisoners. And she lost. The judge said that he could see that this was horrible for the female prisoners, that they would have felt scared. He understood that they were mostly women who had experienced domestic and sexual violence. They were mostly in on drug crimes, etc. And now this person's a physiologically totally normal male, is in with them, was convicted for sex crimes, had been put into this prison because that was nice for her, him, whatever you want to say. But that was okay. That was something that the government had the right to do, that the law gave them the right to do this. So Julie did an interview with this victim, and she talked about the sex crime. She talked about this trans woman, and she called this person he. Now, this is somebody who sexually assaulted her. I think she's got the right to describe the reality as she experienced it. The Daily Mail ran the story, and without asking her, without even telling her, they changed her quotes to call this trans woman, inside her quotes, she.
Oh, that is deeply
So this woman
unethical.
now, isn't it, in print, this woman is saying, she touched me, she rubbed up against me and pressed her groin against me, this sort of thing. I mean, this is why I say it is primarily and above all a linguistic movement. You take control of the language, and then you have so confused everybody, and now what you've got is you've got women who rape, you've got women who commit sexual assaults, you've got women who go run amok with axes in supermarkets. So now you can say, well, women are very violent too. There are violent women and there are violent men. So what's your issue? Why are we trying to, you've just messed up everything. You've lost the way of saying what's actually happening. There are male people, there are female people. They're different in significant ways. That matters for the female people especially.
That has blown my mind. I'd not heard of that. And that's, yeah. I mean, I'm very aware of the language journalists use around this issue now and feed into these linguistic tricks. But to actually change somebody's direct quote, a victim, no less, to tie in with the prevailing gender propaganda, really, that's quite
but this has been going on for years.
Right.
So there was another case a couple of years ago where a woman was assaulted by a trans woman at an event to talk about gender the Gender Recognition Act and reforming it to gender self-ID. So for anyone who's not in these debates, the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 is the British law that allows people to change the sex on their birth certificate in certain highly gate-kept circumstances. You have to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, you have to have 2 doctors sign you off, you have to present it in role for 2 years as a member of the opposite sex. You don't have to have had any surgery or any hormones, but they have to think you're serious. Gender self-ID would just be that you'd fill a form in online, swear that you mean it before a solicitor, and they would change your birth certificate. So you could change yourself to be a woman, and I could change myself to be a man, and no doctor would have to be involved. There'd be no test of any sort. And the government was considering moving to this. So in 2017, 2018, there was a lot of women's meetings to try and explain that this was going to happen, get opposition, get the government to start listening to women about their concerns. And at one of these events, outside it, there was a counter-protest sort of thing with some trans people. One of the trans woman, early 20s, I'd say, 6 foot, just looks like a bloke, and took a swing at one of the women who was going in, who's in her 60s, tiny little character, and punched her in the face.
Wow.
And fullness of time, this came to court. The victim stood up and kept saying he. I mean, at the time of the attack, she'd no reason to think this person identified as anything except a man. This person just looks like a man, And the judge kept saying, you're misgendering. This is very bad. And she sort of tried really hard not to, but she kept slipping because she's trying to describe her memory,
Yeah.
And in the end, the trans woman was found guilty, but the victim was severely told off by the judge and was told she was not getting any compensation because she had refused to correctly gender the bloke who had punched her in the face.
This is insane to me. I mean, it seems to be a concerted effort to protect potential hurt feelings over safety or obtaining justice.
Well, ask yourself whose hurt feelings and whose safety.
Yeah, well, biological men, primarily.
Yeah.
It does feel that way. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I imagine you would have seen the other day, PureGym got in a bit of hot water on social media. PureGym's a UK gym company, and somebody had complained on Twitter that they had seen somebody who looked completely like a male, not a trans woman in any way or appearance, somebody who just looked like a man, let themselves into the female changing room. And apparently to be able to obtain access to this area, you need a certain swipe card that has to be pre-authorized beforehand. And PureGym, or a representative for them, or social media marketing exec, I'm not sure who, responded to the complaint to say essentially that members can use any changing room that applies to the gender that they feel most comfortable with. So essentially, if I tick female on my gym membership sign-up form, I will get no questions asked an access pass to a female space which is enclosed, where there will be women in vulnerable situations, naked, showers, etc. Now that is incredible that that's sort of becoming the norm without any questions asked.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the only way it can not seem odd to you is if you refuse to think of the material reality and you only think of the words. So if you think this person's a woman and it's the woman's changing room, so where else would they go? And, you get to a quite ridiculous point. You really do. There was a similar incident in a spa in LA a few weeks ago, a Korean spa where you're really totally naked is the idea. Like you just go in to the hot tub and the sauna and things naked, and they're sex segregated. And somebody who said they were a trans woman. But I mean, listen, you just said, just a man, not necessarily a trans woman. There's no difference. With self-ID, the only objective characteristic of a trans woman is that they're male. There's no requirement to dress differently or something. And anyway, who gives a shit about how people dress? I don't care how people dress. You can wear a skirt or what you like. It doesn't change who you are, I mean, I think it's actually very regressive to think that how you dress and how you present yourself in some way changes your sex or your social category. Anyway, so this person who's just a bearded, bloke, and every interview I give these days, I end up saying cock and balls. But anyway, there we go. Has meat and two veg, I had decided to try to say instead.
Switch it up. Why not? Variety and all that.
Yeah. And sat down, legs akimbo, at the edge of the hot tub when there's some entirely naked women and children in the hot tub. Now, you can't get away. You don't know where to look. If this is awful, like this woman said she had a small child and she managed to whoosh the child away and so on. And then, I mean, what happened afterwards is the really revealing thing. Like the spa said correctly that under California law, they have no choice, that people are the identity they say they are. They have to allow in anyone who says they're female to the female space. Otherwise, it's regarded as anti-trans discrimination. the LA Times wrote the most extraordinary editorial in which they sort of said, well, we mustn't really condemn the women who mind this sort of stuff as total bigots. We must give them some time to get their stupid, old-fashioned heads up to date. I mean, genitals that appear to be male, will take some getting used to. I mean, I'm slightly parodying what they said, but that expression, genitals that appear to be male, was in this editorial.
God.
Those genitals appear to be male because they are male. They are not a variant female.
The genitals
type
formerly
of genital.
known as male.
Yeah, so that's the way they manage to get around it. That they think they're very good and big by giving women time to get used to the fact that there's going to be cock in their women's faces. And then Laurie Penny, like British journalist, young woman who has written well about, in the past, not anymore, about women's issues and feminism and male violence and so on. She was commenting on this story in a way like these women are total bigots and this is all a setup of the right. I like the way, by the way, that they simultaneously think that this is a setup by far-right forces and something that we should allow. If you're so happy with this that you put it into the law, then why would the far-right need to set it up? It's obviously completely fine. You think it's fine. So why would you object? Anyway, Laurie Penny, somebody asked her, do you think that my small child should be able to go into a changing room without seeing a grown man's genitals? And she said, how do you think my child would feel? And she said, how would I know how your child would feel? But you shouldn't be looking anyway.
Yeah, I did see that. The implication was there was something perverted or rude about noticing
this 8-year-old child, this posited 8-year-old child is a little pervert for looking at the flasher's penis. I mean, seriously, I've been flashed. I think most women have been flashed at some point. I mean, really, a lot of women will say to you that the first time they saw male genitals was some bloke out in the street who flashed at them. And I went to the police and they didn't take it at all seriously. I mean, I was a teenager at this point and I felt, we need to record these crimes. I know nothing's going to happen, but, the incidence of male sexual predation, entitlement, non-contact assault, contact assault, etc., is just enormous. And we don't record most of it. So I felt that I should go and have it recorded. I mean, I don't know if he even wrote it down, but anyway, I tried. He didn't say to me, what sort of pervert are you that you looked? But that's what this bloody Laurie Penny did. The 8-year-old's a pervert because she looks at the bloke's penis.
There's this strange sort of intersectional scale now, and for whatever reason, transgenderism's come out on top. And I find that often sensible people who would stand up and shout from the rooftops about women's rights and the dangers of males in enclosed spaces are somewhat stifled because I think they reflectively want to side on the side of transgenderism rather than just being more objective. I mean, one of the big topics, and you cover this in your book, and it's getting a lot of attention at the moment because of the Tokyo Olympics, is this idea of sport and biological men competing in the women's categories. And I suppose the totem for this whole discussion has been Laurel Hubbard, formerly competed as a male, still does obviously, but they now compete in the female category. Seemed a very, very average athlete when competing as a male. Now they identify as a female, seem to be doing exceedingly well. Is there a link, do you think?
I mean, of course. There was a video, I think, it was going around the rounds a couple of days ago. I'm not sure who made it. It was just a nice video about the wonderful women who are going to the Olympics. And it was half Simone Biles and half other people. Like, Simone Biles is a phenomenon. Nobody is going to be as good as her for absolutely ages because she has literally every perfect gift that you could have, including, for example, being 4'8", which is a huge advantage in gymnastics because she can fit in an extra turn on the mat. So there's just not going to be anybody so super springy and so super tiny and so super driven as her for a long time in her sport. This is her last Olympics, and I think she's 24. That's what she said. It's her last Olympics. She can't do it again. Her body has had it, really. She's just not going to be as good at 28. Laurel Hubbard is 43.
That's insane, isn't it?
And Laurel Hubbard was in this bloody video. It was only about 3 minutes long, and there were all these extraordinary women. And, the things they were saying about the women, it's the last Olympics for Simone Biles. I'm not a huge sports fan except for cricket. I come from a cricketing family. I'm not even a cricketing fan, to be honest, but I do watch it. So I can't remember all the names of the other athletes, but one of them was talking about bringing her child, whether she could bring her child to the Olympics, and somebody else, Alison Felix, I think it is, has got back to being, absolutely one of the fastest people in the world, like the fastest in her distance. And she's come back from childbirth. They're talking about the realities of physical female embodiment. And that is why we have a female category, because female embodiment is different than male embodiment. And, I didn't actually realize how big the differences were before I wrote the book and looked them up, because, I can see when we're different enough that we can see at a heartbeat, whether somebody's male or female. But unless you actually regularly arm wrestle with your brother or something, you maybe don't notice how weak you are in comparison to men. Or, you're beaten up regularly or something like that. Those women know perfectly well how weak they are. But, a lucky woman like me who doesn't experience male violence, or who doesn't, spar with, with men for boxing purposes or something like that, isn't aware of how much physically weaker we are. But we really are. And it's especially up here. So the legs are weaker, the hips are less stable, the alignment of everything is less good. There's a whole load of stuff going on in our abdomen that, men don't need space for that stuff. Shoulders are narrower. And then all this musculature is just very, very different in men and women. So just lifting is it's like 50%. Just if you were to say where Laurel Hubbard was as a man, like where in the, the best to the worst in the world, and then you were to look for the woman who's in that position for the women, exactly the same, that woman will be 50% weaker than Laurel Hubbard. So if Laurel Hubbard is at the 20th percentile and this woman is at the 20th percentile, Laurel Hubbard has 50% advantage. So that's why Laurel Hubbard slots in very near the top, and possibly at the top, let's say.
Yeah.
For women.
I mean, that age thing is incredible. He's in his 40s, obviously.
He's past it, yeah.
He's over the hill is my point. Now, I don't want to see women miss out to biological men, but there is an argument that this could possibly, on the world stage, be the best thing to happen for Hubbard to just clean up, claim gold, and show the entire world what the issue is. I hope that'll happen, because there's a lot of very stupid people around, and if Laurel Hubbard doesn't meddle, people will say, see, it wasn't unfair. Exactly, and that is a possibility because he is over the hill.
Exactly. And there are some extraordinary women there. Yes. So if Laurel Hubbard doesn't meddle and people say, okay, see, it was fair, here's the explanation for why it's not. Laurel Hubbard's really not very good, very mediocre man, right? Now, suppose the way that this mediocre man gave himself a boost was to, stick an engine in a bike race, or, take drugs, or get some aid for lifting or whatever. And he's 10% behind the best person in some notional competition, and that aid only gives him 5%. He still doesn't win, but he's cheated, right? So Laurel Hubbard is in that situation. I'm not saying Laurel Hubbard is cheating, because the rules allow male people to identify into female sporting competitions. The rules are shit, but anyway, Laurel Hubbard is not a cheat. But Laurel Hubbard is bringing male advantage that's extremely large. It's just that Laurel Hubbard isn't a very good male. So if he doesn't win, it's because he's not a very good male. It's not because it was fine. It's not fine.
And to be honest, people have already lost to him because he's taken a place. But it's difficult to have this conversation.
Are you okay with us just having misgendered right the way through that?
I would say I would prefer to be polite and say she, just because I want to communicate to the widest audience possible. And we've acknowledged how difficult it is. I think it's a difficult one, isn't it?
Laurel Hubbard is a man who's competing as a woman. There's no two ways about it.
Right. No, but so I suppose the difference is if these are the new rules of politeness and civility, I will use the pronouns that the person, or at least make an effort to. It's not always going to be easy to remember, but as long as I can maintain the opinion that she's still biologically male, I'm happy with that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point. If you could say, without being shouted down, Laurel Hubbard is a woman, she's a she, but she's male, and everybody accepted that, then we could try and move forward. But of course, you're not allowed to say that. As soon as they take woman and she, they want to take male too, like female as well. They want to say that Laurel Hubbard is female. Now, that's rock bottom. We can't let that go, because those are terms that are used right across all of biology. They're not just human terms, the way that woman and man are. Yeah. Animals can be male or female too. Plants can be male or female too. Parts of plants can be male or female. And those words mean the same thing in every one of those species, exactly the same thing. We can't just have them mean something different just in humans, because it's a very real thing. We'd need another word for it if we were going to do that. But in American law now, like the Equality Act that's being drafted and written and that, may become federal law, what it says is that the words male and female mean what you identify as. So a trans male in American law will be, and already is in many states, a trans male person is someone who was identified as female at birth, but now asserts a male identity. So they've used the words female and male to mean two different things in the same sentence there. It's doublethink. But so now, to me, a trans male is a trans woman. It's a male person who identifies out of their sex. They're trans, so they identify into womanhood. But to them, a trans male is what I would call a female. It's an actual female person, but they're calling them a trans male. So they've completely messed with the language. So we're not allowed to stop at Laurel Hubbard is a woman. I refer to Laurel Hubbard as she because I'm not a rude person. But, Laurel Hubbard is male and that's an issue for sport. They're like, no, Laurel Hubbard is female too.
I think that's it. I think it's just the context and the fact that she was a man for 35 years or so. So,
and biologically, this person is still a man. We can't change sex.
And I think if you're looking at the context of somebody doing something on the face of it, which seems quite unfair, I think your patience for civility and using the correct terms is reduced understandably. I think we were talking about the woman in court describing her attacker as a male rather than a female. So it's something we've all got to figure out. And and
it's more than civility. It's describing reality.
Yeah.
I don't want to be forced to say my issue with Laurel Hubbard in women's competitions is that she's a trans woman. I want to say my issue with Laurel Hubbard in female competitions is that Laurel Hubbard is male. I'm not prejudiced against Laurel Hubbard because this person is trans-identified. I'm not prejudiced against Laurel Hubbard at all. I just want Laurel Hubbard to compete in the male category because Laurel Hubbard is male. That's all I want. I don't want to use the word trans at all because it's irrelevant. I just want to talk about male and female sexes, bodies, irreducible biological reality.
That sounds reasonable. Do you have 5 minutes just to touch on one final question? Are you in a rush?
Of course, yeah.
Excellent. I'm glad, actually, because this is one I wanted to talk about because we spend a lot of time focusing on women's spaces and sports, which are all really important. But I sometimes think the problem of how this affects young teenage girls gets glossed over or overlooked. And there's this idea of social contagion or peer contagion, which is quite compelling. This idea that young girls can get involved in a reinforcement loop of affirmation for their new gender identity or their new sexuality. And we see this cluster amongst young girls. There seems to be an overrepresentation of young trans girls within a group of friends. And for me, this makes a lot of sense. But is it, on the other side of it, it seems a little bit a bit of an inconvenient truth because there is shades of how we thought about homosexuality, the idea of if we normalize homosexuality, if we allow for it, if we afford the rights, you could catch the gay, essentially. This idea that as soon as we say homosexuality is okay, that just opens the door for everybody to be gay, which I can't see the problem with that anyway. But how do we distinguish that sort of mentality from the concept of social contagion?
I think you kind of go back a bit further first and you say that your problem isn't with people at all, actually, when it comes to trans ideology. It's to do with the ideology itself and the way it reconceptualizes human beings and human nature in ways that are consequential for everybody and for public policy. So when someone says that what makes someone a woman is their womanly inner essence or inner identity or something, they're saying that's true for me as well. That I have some sort of womanly inner essence. I regard that as a very sexist thing to say. I don't have any womanly inner essence. I'm just a female person who didn't die. And so that's why I'm a woman. And I could do and be anything with that. So it's a very different thing than saying some people are attracted to the same sex and some people are attracted to the opposite sex and some are attracted to both. That's a thing that people do and feel, and yes, they may identify as it as well. When you realize this about yourself, you may claim a gay identity, and this may be something that you wear with pride, and it may be something that becomes a really important aspect of your self-conception. That's fine. But you're not saying something about everybody else. You're not saying everybody is same-sex attracted, or that by being same-sex attracted, you've changed sex, or that say you're a gay man, that every man has to find you attractive or something. You're not saying something that's about everybody. You're just explaining who you are. And superficially, it looks like trans people are doing the same thing. It looks like they're saying, this is who I am. And that is often what trans people do say. And I can see why they say it. It's how they feel. And individual trans people often aren't proclaiming this whole grand totalizing ideology. They are just saying, look, I was very miserable. I'm happier now that I think of myself this way. And fine, we can accommodate that. It's the big grand notion that everybody is who they say they are, and that all of us must see them that way and treat them that way. And, when it comes to sports or prisons or changing rooms or anything, we must all see them that way. And now this has massive consequences for the rest of us as well, specifically the women. So that's the difference. To the extent that trans people are proclaiming how they feel about themselves in the world, that's completely fine. To the extent that they're telling, and I don't think it's them, I think it's the activists actually, to the extent that the activists are telling everybody how they must feel about themselves, how they must see everybody else, and how they must accept public policy being rewritten, that's completely different than the gay pride movement or the gay rights movement. And then within that, you've got to think about young people growing up into the world and being told things about themselves and the world and about humanity. And teenagers are very idealistic and ideological creatures. They're sponges for ideas, and they're deciding who they are and looking around for all sorts of identities. And they identify as, a harp player one year and, a rower the next. They're trying on all sorts of different things. And for the girls, this is all being done against the backdrop of misogyny. And, like most girls now at 12 or 13 have breasts, and, that has consequences for how they're treated on the street when they're still children. They feel like children, but men sometimes treat them as women. Very unpleasant. There's pornography out there that's disgusting that children see, and girls don't want to grow up to be that belittled, spat upon, abused character that they see in porn. And so they're in this self-creation moment of their lives as they're transitioning from childhood to adulthood. It's difficult to be a woman. It's difficult to grow into being a woman. And they're being offered this option, which is that you don't have to be. One of the things that you could do is you could identify as something easier and nicer. I don't, by the way, think life is easier for men. But I do think it can look like it is when you're a teenage girl. And, they're told at a very vulnerable time that they can leave behind the things that are difficult and that they can start afresh even maybe, that there's a new identity possible. So the latest trend is very much that they aren't identifying as boys, they're identifying out of femalehood, but not into malehood. So they choose something like non-binary or gender fluid. So I think unless you talk to kids, as I have in, big liberal cities, say, people who have parents who would have been very pro-gay rights and were delighted when gay marriage happened and things, you'll be astonished if you haven't done it to discover just how many of the girls in particular, without bothering to tell teachers or parents, identify as non-girls. They have a different persona at school. There's their own group now that they regard themselves as non-binary and that they use they, them pronouns or neo-pronouns, and they've maybe picked a different name, and it's often a name like Phoenix or Neo that signifies rebirth or leaving the past behind or whatever, And in some ways that's harmless, like if it's just a phase, but it's based on a very sexist idea of what boys and girls are. Like they don't want to be girls because they hate girlhood. Abigail Schreier has written an entire book about this cohort of girls. Very interesting.
Oh, irreversible
and in
damage.
She has this phrase, irreversible damage, that's right. And she says, these girls they don't seem to me to be identifying into boyhood. They seem to be me to be running from girlhood as if from a house on fire. And because she's quite a conservative religious person, she's a conservative Jew, she sees it differently to me. She wants them to be taught how lovely it is to be a girl and what a wonder it is to be a woman. And I liked being a girl and I like being a woman and I like being a mother too, but I just don't think that's going to quite talk to this cohort quite the way she wants it to.
I mean,
I could be wrong.
It wouldn't be so bad because obviously there are phases we all went through as teenagers, and I do personally think sort of adolescence is particularly difficult for young girls than it is young boys, but I suppose that's just my subjective viewing on it. But the issue on top of this is there's a sort of pressure or an advice to young people now that maybe, just maybe, you might be transgender. It's an idea that's an idea that's put into people's heads, and it's. If it wouldn't have occurred to you without somebody suggesting it, that is a bit like the idea that, cutting yourself will make you feel better, or starving yourself will make you feel beautiful, or allow you to vanish from the attention you don't want, or indeed becoming very fat will get rid of the male attention that you hate so much, or, these very unhelpful ideas that we know from past experience over the last several decades.
if you don't say them, if girls never hear them, some of them may come upon these ideas themselves. But if you do say them, much larger numbers do. And in particular, they teach each other. Like hospitals don't treat anorexics together anymore because they used to just make each other much worse.
Yeah.
So there are these group dynamics that are incredibly important in teen years. And this is now an idea that's landed in without any thought on those groups, where it's kind of metastasized. And, if they're just experimenting and calling each other Phoenix and trying to remember to use they, them, and it's almost fun, really, if you can ignore the sexism it's based on. But of course, some of them go further and then medicalize. And so what should just have been a somewhat strange youth subculture, with some troubling aspects to it, but then what subculture doesn't, turns into something that has lifelong consequences, which is why Abigail called the book Irreversible Damage. So if you take hormones, cross-sex hormones, really quite quickly, it does things to you that can't be undone. And those are more noticeable for female people than for male ones. So testosterone is a one-way street. Testosterone does things that don't get undone. You don't, if you take testosterone for long enough to grow a beard and have your voice break, you can stop taking testosterone for the rest of your life, but your beard will keep growing and your voice will still be deep.
Yeah, it's very concerning. And like I said, I think the that angle of it is something that doesn't get as much attention as some of the other aspects. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see a big fallout from this issue in terms of detrans, which thankfully are starting to get more attention. But Helen, I absolutely loved the book. I recommend it to everyone I speak to. And I've sort of noticed as well how difficult it is, especially for women, making reasonable noises in this space, the sort of vitriol that comes your way, particularly online. So I just want to say thank you for writing the book, and I do think it's quite a courageous thing to be doing as well. We could do with more reasonable voices like yours on the issue.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you.
My pleasure.